Why would a boy walk into his former school with a rifle and fire into classrooms like they were targets in a game? It happened on Valentine's Day 2018. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, Parkland, Florida. 17 people killed, 17 more injured. The kind of horror that usually belongs to history books or nightmares. But it was real.
He was just 19. His name was Nikolas Cruz.
Not a foreign terrorist, not a hardened gangster. A boy who had once walked those same hallways carrying a backpack instead of bullets. A former student. A face that had blended in, forgotten by most, until that day. Witnesses say he moved like someone on autopilot. Calm, focused, cold. He pulled the fire alarm to draw them out, and then he opened fire. There was no mercy, no hesitation, only control, precise, chilling control. When he was arrested later, he didn't resist, didn't scream. He just looked at the officers with eyes that didn't blink much, like nothing inside was moving anymore. And I kept asking myself, what makes a child become a murderer? Was it one moment, or 1,000 quiet ones stacked up over the years, like sandbags before a flood? Somewhere long before the bullets, something cracked.
And no one heard it.
He was born into chaos. Nikolas Cruz entered the world already missing something, the embrace of biological parents. He was adopted as an infant by Linda and Roger Cruz. On the surface, it seemed like salvation. But sometimes love isn't enough to fill the silence that grows in a child's mind. Roger died when Nikolas was still young. That left Linda alone with 2 adopted boys and more stress than warmth in the house. She tried. God knows she tried. But trying doesn't replace presence, doesn't replace understanding. Nikolas was a quiet child, but not the kind of quiet that means peace. His silence was heavy, observant, waiting. He had tantrums that shattered glass, rage that no one could explain. Therapists came and went, diagnoses were floated, ADHD, autism spectrum, depression. But nothing truly changed. There's a story one neighbor told, a time they heard a crash, then a pause, and then the slow sound of a door locking. That locked door, it became a pattern. He'd retreat there when the world was too much. Sit with a crumpled teddy bear he refused to throw away even when its seams split and its eyes fell off. The bear never judged him. It never scolded. It never said, "What's wrong with you?" Inside that room, something darker began to take root. Not because he was born evil, but because the world outside the door didn't seem to care what happened behind it. The first crack in his perception wasn't a scream. It was the quiet realization that no one was coming in, and maybe no one ever would. School was supposed to be the place where he could start again. But the classrooms were loud, the rules were rigid, and the kids, they noticed. They noticed his awkward pauses, the way he didn't quite know how to smile back, the way his eyes darted too fast or stayed locked too long. He became the kid with the weird walk, the one who muttered to himself, who always sat alone. At first they ignored him. Then they laughed. Pencils went missing, names were whispered, lunch trays were kicked over in the cafeteria. Sometimes he'd try to fit in, make a joke, say something he thought was clever, but it landed like a brick. Blank stares, raised eyebrows, or worse, mocking smiles. No one listened, no one really looked. And over time, something hardened. He stopped raising his hand. He stopped meeting eyes. The notebooks in his backpack weren't filled with homework. They were filled with drawings. Guns, blood, explosions, small stick figures with X's over their eyes. Teachers marked his behavior. Administrators called him troubled. But no one really asked what it felt like to walk through the halls as a ghost that was still breathing. He once wrote in a school assignment, "I feel like I was born to die." No one followed up. No one knocked on that locked door. So he stopped trying to be seen and started wondering what it would feel like if just once they saw him, but only when it was too late. That thought, it clung to him like smoke.
And smoke has a way of finding fire.
Puberty didn't bring answers.
It brought louder thoughts. It brought a voice inside that didn't whisper anymore, it commanded.
Nikolas started lying. Small things at first, saying he did his homework when he didn't, saying he was fine when he wasn't. He realized people believed what they wanted to believe.
So he gave them a version of himself that was easier to digest.
But underneath, something darker stirred. He began stealing. From stores, from classmates, once from his own mother's purse. Not because he needed anything, but because it made him feel in control.
When the world ignored you, power even in small doses became addictive.
He'd talk to himself at night, holding that battered teddy bear voice, trembling but determined. Arguing, rehearsing, imagining.
Sometimes he'd punch the walls, scratch his own arms, cry without knowing why.
But he never told anyone. Because by then, he knew the answer no one wanted to know. There was a girl once. She smiled at him, asked if he liked a certain band. For a moment the fog lifted, but when he tried to talk to her the next day, she laughed, not cruelly, just uncomfortably.
And that was enough.
He began to see people as puzzles he couldn't solve. Or worse, actors reading from a script he'd never been given.
So he wrote his own script, in drawings, in dark fantasies, in carefully constructed masks of what normal looked like.
Smile, nod, don't speak too long, pretend you're okay. He was losing himself, but at least he was in control of the mask.
And behind that mask, the voice kept asking, "What if I stop pretending?" By the time he turned 18, Nikolas Cruz had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. If you smile enough, people stop asking questions.
He got a job, wore a uniform, said yes sir and thank you. He talked about joining the military, about being useful, about being someone.
And some people bought it. They said he was quiet, polite, even a little odd, sure, but harmless.
He made a few online friends, joined forums, played video games, said the right things, typed smiley faces, reacted with LOL.
But none of it felt real.
It was a performance, a carefully rehearsed one. He wanted connection, but only if he could control it. He wanted attention, but feared rejection more. He'd learned how to mimic empathy, learned when to laugh, when to frown. But inside he felt nothing. The teddy bear was now stuffed in a drawer, its eyes gone, one ear torn, but he still touched it sometimes. Late at night. Like pressing rewind on a life that no longer made sense.
He walked past old classmates who didn't remember him. He saw couples holding hands and wondered what it would feel like to be seen, held, needed.
But every time he tried to reach out, the voice inside whispered, "They'll leave. They always do." So he became good at pretending. A chameleon, a shell. But the more he faked it, the less he recognized the person underneath. And sometimes in the mirror, he'd stare at his own reflection and ask, "Does anyone really see me, or just the version I created for them?" Every breaking point has a sound.
For Nikolas, it wasn't a scream. It was a soft click, the sound of a door locking.
Again, he had been expelled from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High. For fights, for threats, for scaring people. He'd been suspended more times than he could count. Each time it felt like the world confirming what he already believed.
You don't belong.
But this time expulsion was final.
A sealed fate.
He tried to act like it didn't matter, said he didn't care. But he did. Deeply. That school was the last place that still tethered him to the idea of normal. The last place where someone might have seen him differently. Now it was just one more locked door. Then came his mother's death. Linda Cruz. The only person who had ever called him my son. Even if she didn't always understand him, even if she yelled, even if she feared him, she was there.
Gone just like that. Pneumonia. November 2017.
He didn't cry at the funeral. He just watched the casket disappear into the earth and thought, that's it. There's no one now.
He moved in with a friend's family. They tried to help, but they weren't equipped. Not for someone whose grief looked like silence and whose pain looked like detachment.
He started posting online. Dark things, violent things, messages like "I'm going to be a school shooter." And still no one stepped in. He bought an AR-15, legally.
The world had always looked past him. Now he would make sure they looked straight at him. And that sound, the click of a door, turned into something louder.
This world deserves to be punished. February 14th, 2018. Valentine's Day.
A day meant for love. Notes, candy hearts, red balloons. Nikolas Cruz walked toward his old school with a black duffel bag and a storm inside his chest. He had planned this. Step by step, but planning and doing are two different things. One is quiet, the other is irreversible.
He pulled the fire alarm, That sound, shrill, urgent, familiar, echoed through the halls like a memory.
Students poured out. Teachers called for order. Feet shuffled. Laughter. Confusion.
Then the gunshots. He moved slowly, calmly, room to room, hall to hall. Some ran, some froze, some didn't have time to do either.
He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't crying either.
His breathing was steady, his heart not racing. He later told investigators, "I felt nothing." But that wasn't true. He felt something. Control. For the first time in his life, no one ignored him. Every eye was on him. Every scream said, "You exist." 17 people died that day. Teenagers, teachers, friends. And after the last shot, he stopped, dropped the weapon, walked away, blended into the crowd, bought a drink at Subway, sat at McDonald's.
Like it was any other day.
But something had changed forever. And the detail I can't forget, the one that haunts me, was when one surviving student said he didn't even blink.
No trembling, no remorse.
Just a long, empty stare. And when police finally arrested him, he didn't resist, because in his mind, the performance was over. And in that final act, the invisible boy became unforgettable. After the blood, after the sirens, after the headlines came the silence.
In custody, Nikolas Cruz didn't cry, didn't scream. He just sat, staring.
He confessed almost immediately. No resistance, no excuses. He spoke flatly, like someone describing a dream that had already faded. When asked why, he said, "I felt like I had to do it."
The officers who interviewed him said he seemed lost. Not proud, not regretful, just hollow. He didn't ask about the victims. He didn't ask about what would happen next. He asked for a lawyer and a soda.
In his cell, he paced, drew pictures, talked to himself. Sometimes he whispered things no one could understand. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when the mask slipped. A tear, a flinch, a trembling lip when asked about his mother. But then it would vanish. Some believe he hoped to die that day, suicide by cop. But when they didn't shoot, he had to live with what he'd done. Others think he wanted fame, a name in history. But his face, when shown his own news coverage, didn't light up.
It dimmed.
In those days after the shooting, there was one word he used again and again: free. For the first time, he said, "I felt free." Not from prison, but from pretending. He no longer had to fake smiles, no longer had to be normal. In the most twisted way imaginable, committing the crime let him stop hiding.
And in that realization, I saw the most terrifying thing of all. Sometimes the mask we wear to survive becomes heavier than the monster we're trying to contain.
When they brought him into the courtroom, he looked smaller than I expected.
Not a monster, not a mastermind, just a 19-year-old in an orange jumpsuit, hands chained, eyes flickering between the floor and nothing at all.
People watched him like he was a creature from a nightmare. Some cried, some shook with rage, some begged the judge for justice, for death, for something to erase what he had done. Nikolas Cruz said little. Sometimes he nodded, sometimes he blinked too slowly.
But mostly he was still.
He pleaded guilty, admitted to every shot, every death, every choice.
And yet even in confession, it was hard to tell who we were looking at.
Was he the cold-blooded killer who planned it all with clarity? Or was he the boy who once sat alone, clutching a headless teddy bear, wondering why no one ever knocked on his door? One psychiatrist who evaluated him said something that stayed with me.
He's not insane, but he's profoundly broken.
No voices told him to kill, no delusions guided his hand. Just a lifetime of being unseen. Now the world saw him. Every detail of his past was picked apart. Every video, every message, every bruise of his childhood exposed.
But it was too late.
When the trial ended and the sentence was read, life in prison without parole, he didn't react. No gasp, no sigh, just a single blink. And I remember thinking, not a demon,
But a frightened child in the body of a murderer.
a child who finally took off the mask, and there was no one left to recognize him underneath. This story didn't begin with a gun. It began with silence, with a boy born into uncertainty, raised in confusion, surrounded by noise but never truly heard. Nikolas Cruz wasn't always a killer. He was once a baby held in someone's arms, a child walking into kindergarten with wide eyes and a backpack too big, a boy who drew pictures of helicopters and superheroes, But he was also a boy who sat in locked rooms whispering to stuffed animals, a boy who heard more laughter at his expense than encouragement in his ears. People ask, could this have been prevented? I ask, what if someone had noticed the drawing, the whisper, the flinch when his name was called? What if someone had said, "You matter," before he needed a gun to prove he existed? This crime didn't erupt from nowhere. It was years in the making. Each ignored warning, each closed door, each adult who said he's just difficult.
And maybe if someone had stepped through that door, it might have stayed closed the day of the shooting.
He is not the only one. Right now, there are other kids. Quiet, strange, isolated, walking through crowded schools like shadows. Not every shadow turns violent, but every shadow has a story.
And the question is,
will we wait until it bleeds into headlines, or will we listen while there's still time to hear? Because the next Nikolas Cruz may already be waiting. Not for fame, not for death, just for someone to knock and say, "I see you."